Hey everybody, John Wagon here, coming to you with another Lightboard lesson today. And today we're going to talk about HTTP2 and what it is, some enhancements that have been made over the previous versions of HTTP, and why you should care about them. So to go way back, we started out with back in like 1996 with HTTP1. I'm going to write a couple things up here. So we'll say like 1996, we had, that's a 6, we had HTTP 1.0, and that was good. You know, back then websites were not that complex. There wasn't a lot of JavaScript and CSS and a lot of images and a lot of things that you had to deal with. And so HTTP 1.0 was good for a time. But then things became more complex, so we need to kind of upgrade and we need to move along with technology. And so in 1999, we had HTTP 1.1 that was developed, and that served us for a long time. A couple of quick things about HTTP 1.0. One of the limitations that it had was for every TCP connection, you could get one request and one response. And so imagine a website that's got, say 5 images in it. You need all 5 of those images. Then you would establish a TCP connection. You would say, hey, I need image number 1, and it would give you image number 1, and then you would close the connection. Then you would open up a new connection, say I need image 2, give you image 2, you close the connection. Imagine how ridiculously slow and inefficient that is when you get these really big complex websites. So that's why HTTP 1.0 didn't really work very well for very long, because things got pretty complex. So one TCP connection per request response. HTTP 1.1 things you could open up multiple, or you could have multiple requests and responses per TCP connection. And what some people would do is they would open up multiple TCP connections in order to kind of layer. Hey, if I can only get one request response, let's say per TCP connection, I'm going to open up like a whole bunch of TCP connections in order to get a whole bunch of stuff all at the same time. So it's kind of a workaround, as it were. But then that gets into some of the TCP protocol inefficiencies and some of the congestion control that TCP tries to do that effectively negates all of that. And so as people would try to work around, to gain efficiencies, it sort of negated the design of TCP in general. So anyway, but nonetheless, HTTP 1.1 became kind of the default standard, the de facto standard for many, many years. And in fact, all the way up until like 2009, so I'm going to put 2009 here, and that's when Google came out with this thing called Speedy, the Speedy Protocol. And that was a somewhat proprietary in the sense that Google was the one that introduced it, developed it, and all that stuff. So it wasn't like a standards body like IETF, for example, that maybe controls the HTTP protocol. It was kind of Google doing their thing. Now, granted, Google's a pretty big entity doing their thing, but nonetheless, they came up with the Speedy Protocol. And it had things like, I'll put security was required in this thing. It had multiplexing. So this is where you could send multiple requests per TCP connection and then get multiple responses, or you could multiplex those into a single. And so it just gained a lot of efficiencies with all these more complex websites. But nonetheless, as Speedy kind of gained some traction, this other, the standards body came up with what we now know as HTTP2. So this was in 2015. HTTP2 came out, and a couple of nomenclature points on this. I'm going to put HTTP/2. Some people said, should we call it 2.0? And the standards body said, hey, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. After a lot of discussion, they said, no, let's not call it 2.0 because that may get confused with some of this 1.0, 1.1, whatever. So it's just HTTP2 is what it's called now. And so as a result of what HTTP2 allows us to do, Google effectively said, hey, you know what, we're going to back off on Speedy and we're just going to use what HTTP2 provides. So a few things that I wanted to bring up with HTTP2 that help with some web pages that we have today is this also allows for multiplexing. And so as requests and responses are sent and received, you can have one TCP connection. In fact, I saw one guy talk about it and say, one of the ideas, if you just want to think about this in generally, is you don't want to open up a different TCP connection for every server request response kind of thing. You want to effectively open up the TCP connection, and this one guy put it, he said we want to keep it warm in the sense that we want to open it up, we want to kind of keep it ready to go and utilize it as much as we possibly can before we close it down and get everything out of it that we possibly can. So that's kind of the idea behind HTTP2. And so multiplexing certainly allows with that, or allows for that. Imagine again back on that website that had, say, 5 images or whatever. You could say, hey, I'm going to open up a connection. I need image number 1, number 2, number 3, and then it's going to start serving those. And maybe before it even serves image number 3, you're already asking for image number 4 and 5, and then it's going to completely serve all those, and then you're going to close up your connection. So it's a lot more efficient than certainly these other protocols back here. So multiplexing is a good bonus for HTTP2. There's another thing called server push, and so I'll write this up here, server push. So what server push does is imagine a client that's trying to load a website, and maybe its initial GET request is for index.html, and it wants to load up this web page. Well, let's say that there's JavaScript, let's say there's some CSS in that website, there's images that need to be loaded, all that kind of stuff. Rather than the client having to ask for all those things, what the server can now do is it can say, hey, I know that there's a real good chance that you're gonna, you've asked for index.html initially. I know there's a real good chance you're gonna want this JavaScript, you're gonna want this CSS, and you're gonna want these images, let's say. So I'm gonna go ahead and push those to you before you even ask me. So you can see the efficiencies that are gained there. The client does have the option to deny or decline the server push. However, in most cases, it's it does gain a lot of efficiency, so it doesn't take the back and forth requesting. The server can just go ahead and say, hey, I know you want this thing. So server push is another good one. I'm going to put header compression up here is another great benefit of HTTP2. If you go back to some of the other HTTP protocols, there's a lot of header information that can be duplicated on the wire. If you look at an HTTP header, it's got a lot of stuff in there that can just be sent one time effectively, and so with a slight amount of compression in HTTP2, you can significantly decrease the amount of header information that needs to be transmitted over the wire. So whereas these guys are going to have to send header information every single time and it just duplicates, it gets real clunky, real chunky over the wire, this guy's going to say, let's compress that, let's maybe send it one time, you've got everything you need, and then it shrinks everything down, so it's a lot more efficient. So header compression is a big nice thing in HTTP2. Another one is that this is in binary format versus a textual format in the previous versions of HTTP. Binary is much easier for a computer to parse through. It's much less human readable, but it's a lot more computer readable, so it's a lot faster on the computer. Some would say, and in fact this is effectively true, that the binary format of HTTP2 and the textual format of HTTP 1.0 and 1.1 are not compatible, and so when you start to intermix the two, it becomes problematic, and we'll get to that in a second. I've got a really good solution for you on that one. But anyway, but binary is binary format's a good thing to have. The other thing I'll put up here is security, and this was a huge discussion in the HTTP2 when the standards body were looking at HTTP2 to figure out what to do about security. And a lot of people said, hey, we need to mandate security with HTTP2. And then other people said, no, we don't need to do that. And what they came to is that they said, you do not have to have security with HTTP2. It's not a mandatory thing. However, effectively, most browsers that utilize HTTP2 require it, and so it kind of becomes mandatory by default anyway. The one thing that I'll say is under security, it does have, it has minimum, I'll put minimum key sizes for encryption, key sizes. So if you are going to use security, you have to use a certain level of key sizes. So elliptic curve, it's got like a minimum level, as well as like RSA or maybe even an AES bulk encryption. You have to use a certain key size minimum. And if you don't use that, then you can, then the server can respond with, inadequate security type response. So you have to use minimum key sizes. There's also ephemeral keys. Ephemeral keys are required if you're going to use security. So while you don't have to use security, there are some things that if and when you do use security, you have to do it correctly. There's also some TLS minimums, so like TLS 1.2 is what you would need to use with HTTP2. So anyway, so these are some interesting and really key components of HTTP2 that now you can utilize, and a lot of clients are starting to go that direction. But let's say you have a server. So I'm going to put a quick little my last little diagram here. Let's say you have your app server back here, and it only speaks with like 1.0 and 1.1, and that's it. But you got clients out here. You got a bunch of mobile clients with their iPhones, or you've got whatever. You've got a browser out here that speaks. Maybe these guys are talking 2.0, and these guys are talking 1.1. And when they come to access your application, if you have a 2.0 request, then that's going to present some problems. So what do you do there? It's kind of like what I talked about a second ago. Well, the perfect answer, of course, is to put a big IP in line. So you put a big IP, you front your servers with a big IP, and guess what this guy can do? This guy can speak all these different languages. So you can have these requests coming in from 2.0, you can have a 1.1, maybe you got a 1.0 coming in here. And then this guy the big IP can understand all those different protocols, all those different versions of the protocol. And then maybe this guy, maybe he has determined that they're only going to speak, HTTP 1.1. So that's what you can do with your big IP based on all these, disparate clients that you have, and then maybe an app server that only speaks in one version of the protocol. So get out there, implement your big IP, let it do all those, conversion and that translation for you. And utilize HTTP2. I mean, it's out there, it's available. It gives you some significant efficiencies, speed, security, those kinds of things that people are really interested in now today. So, again, as the world has changed from back in 1996, and we didn't have very complicated websites, to today where things are really, really complex when it comes to just loading up a fairly simple website. There's a lot that goes on. You really need to move to the protocols that are going to allow for the efficiencies for that. So I hope you've learned a couple things about HTTP2. Hope you implement that big IP, let it do the hard work for you, and that way you don't have to go back and retrofit all your app servers to talk the new language. You can just let the big IP do it for you in the meantime. So anyway, thanks for joining us today. Hope you've learned a couple things about HTTP2, and we'll see you guys out there in the community.